Cool. We're live. Hello, Austin. Hello, Sylvain. Or as we can say, Sil for the American audience. We're having our first stream of registrants come in. So we're just going to be starting in a few seconds. For everyone who's already here, welcome. This is the first episode of the GTM Engineering 101 series. And why we're doing this is because our community came back to us and said, hey, look, we want to be GTM engineers, but we need to start with the fundamentals. What do we need to know? And so we said, okay, let's start with the big picture first. Obviously, GTM engineering is a lot about tactical plays, using tools standalone to find wins, but it's also about building systems and stacks. And so today we have two people who are uniquely qualified to talk about doing that. We have Austin and Sil, who both need few introductions, but for people who don't know them, let's go through both Austin and Sylvain. Um, Austin, thank you for joining us. I know you're usually doing these courses paid. You have one coming up in a couple of weeks, in next week actually. So we're going to be talking about that. Please tell the audience who is Austin, why are we talking about building stacks today, and what have you done so far to sort of give you this perspective?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me, Turk. It's great to be here with you and Sil. Name's Austin, live in Washington, D.C. I've worked in MarTech and RevTech most of my career. I'm also, I guess, a self-described startup operator. I've worked for a few startups like Branch Metrics, mParticle, and Ramp. Why are we here and why are we talking about this thing? Before I answer that question, I'd also just add that even though I have a course coming out in about a week on revenue technology, I also have courses on MarTech, and I have lots of content out there for people who don't want to pay. I'm always down to engage on MarTech and RevTech topics, especially on LinkedIn, where it seems like everybody's talking about B2B stuff these days. Not quite a LinkedIn influencer yet, maybe one day. So a little bit about me, though, and about why I care. Look, I think we're at a really interesting crossroads here. For the last 20 years, there's been kind of a way of building MarTech and revenue tech stacks. Now, those things have gone through cultural waves, but there have always been some underpinnings, namely the fact that you use a tool like a CRM in Salesforce, and you use out-of-box integrations to connect it to a variety of tools. The first stack that I actually built back at Branch when I first started my career, I've posted online in my class. There's a really rough architecture diagram that was actually built in, I think, Apple Notes or something. So the reason I share that is because we're at this crossroads now where people are asking questions about how should I design my revenue organization? What tools should I use? How should those tools be connected? And how do I avoid maybe some of the pitfalls or mistakes that other startups over the last decade have gotten themselves into? Classical wisdom would say, you don't get fired for using a tool that you've used in the past. But I think now more than ever with AI and the way that you can use AI to do things in a new and novel way, it means a lot to be able to just innovate and think about how to approach the world differently. So that's why we're here talking about it. Hopefully some of the ideas that we share today will get people inspired about building revenue cultures and revenue teams in a different way.
Excellent. And for those of you who haven't checked out, Austin is building this very cool tool called Clarify. We're going to be talking about it later in the webinar, and they have published some really good educational material around this topic as well. We're going to try our best to cover as much ground in this event. And now we can head over to Sylvain. Sylvain, tell us, as a Renaissance GTM engineer, as I like to call you, why are we talking about this topic? Tell us about Sylvain, and maybe 5 seconds about the choice of hat today.
Yeah, let's go in reverse. Choice of hat, for people who know me, wear a lot of hat, both metaphorically and in real life. I have like 50 plus hats. Why this one today? Honestly, this was the one closest to my desk when I walked into this room. This is the Montreal Expo hat. I bought it randomly because I thought it was kind of like a French flag, and I learned about the story of Montreal Expo, the baseball team, and so I'm kind of like a fake baseball team fan because everybody's been talking about to me about this that team every time I go on a Zoom call with it. So that's the story about the hat. Who am I? I started my career back in Europe, mostly doing email marketing ops type of things. Then I moved to a company called Pusher, doing dev tool, basically doing PLG before PLG was cool. Led the marketing team, the sales team, ultimately led the ops and data team and became CEO of that company. Moved to America with this company and did all over again at Census, again from like first go-to-market employee, build a sales marketing team, and always trying to build a stack. Why do I care about all of this? Is like I fundamentally believe that technology is a way to have less human in organization or make human a lot more efficient, right? So like I always try to think about what tool, what process, what automation we can put in place to not having to hire human, right? So that's why I care a lot about GTM Engineer and RevTech in general. So yeah, that's looking forward to chat more to all of you about all the good stuff for me.
I like the idea of having that sort of non-human workforce complement your human, right? And so that's the order of things that we're going to be going through. We're going to be starting with fundamentals, right? So let's define what is a stack, what is specifically a revenue stack, what are concepts that we need to master, right? Let's have Austin that does a great job of like taking us through a framework to understand how to evaluate your stack. Sylvain is going to be telling us about how to evolve with your stack as your company grows and so on and so forth. And of course, at the end, we have a very nice segment on AI agents. So if you guys are ready, let's dive in.
Sure.
Do it.
So first up, Austin, you do this really well. Tell us about what is a revenue stack? What does it serve? We're all ears.
Sure. So a lot of people joining this call are going to say, what the hell? Why are we talking about what a revenue stack is? I already know that. Now, the purpose is not to insult anybody here, but it's really to take a step back and say, how is marketing and sales connected? And when we think about this stack, what are the different component pieces? And what's a framework for how we think about these two systems together? The reason I think this is an important thing to consider is because for the longest part of my career, I just thought that I knew these things. I thought that I knew exactly what the purpose of a MarTech stack was. I thought I knew what the purpose of a sales stack was. And I thought that I knew all the component pieces. I think over the course of my career, though, I've learned there's many more component pieces than I realized. And also, especially when you're working with leaders in an organization, they might not have that understanding. So part of the reason why we have this slide here is to make sure we educate everybody on the importance of educating everybody else in your org. Even at a really small company of, call it 10 people, it's not going to be completely obvious to everyone in the room that in order to grow revenue, in order to drive sales, in order to capture leads at the top of the funnel, you actually have to have tools. And the connection of those tools is a stack. So largely speaking, there's two sides of a technology stack. There's MarTech and RevTech or sales tech, but it all follows a funnel. At the top of the MarTech stack, you help acquire people. You have a bunch of capabilities that then help, and don't worry, Tark, I'll let you know when I'm ready to go to the next slide. You capture all these folks, you engage them, you pass that data into your CRM, and from there, you then have a bunch of capabilities that allow you to do things like understand them and close them. So the whole point is basically to manage a lot of different data points across many different surface areas of the funnel, from the point in time where you acquire somebody all the way down to the point in time where you actually close them. I use this funnel analogy because I think it's really helpful in framing up how every part of your stack actually has a purpose. And if you can start to architect your system in a way that aligns to those purposes, it'll be much more clear when you communicate to the rest of your team. Now, obviously, there's a question in a lot of people's heads, which is like, okay, well, what is the best kind of stack for people to use and how do we get here? And we'll get to both those topics, but why don't we actually back up real quick? Tarek, do you want me to control or you want to jump in here?
You can control.
Awesome. Sounds good. So how do we get here, right? How do we get to the point that I just described where you have this full funnel with marketing and sales? Well, there's a couple different eras that I like to think about. The first era was, I would call it even before CDPs existed. This is like maybe before a lot of people on this call were even born. 1999 to 2010. And these were the early days of what is now called sales tech or revenue tech. People had tools like Siebel Systems, and then Salesforce grew out of that. And really, we're talking about the world where you collect contact data inside of a database and you're using it online to check and track people. Now, call it 2015-ish, I would say, was the first time, at least in my modern career, where I started to think, all these tools are starting to be connected in a way that I can actually put down on paper. It wasn't just like we have Salesforce to use to help us close deals. We would have things like a CDP, we would have a CRM, we'd have an outreach tool, we'd have something like MailChimp, and these tools be connected in bespoke ways, sometimes through a CSV import, sometimes through a direct connection, but you'd start to put on a piece of paper exactly what you were doing in your revenue organization and how that mapped to different capabilities. So let's call that like the pre-modern GTM era. Then, kind of 2015, 2016 comes along. People are growing out of what are called DMPs, which allow you to anonymously advertise to people through the use of cookies, and into the CDP era. And now we start to get to this question of what's the difference between a CDP and a CRM? Modern marketing technology all is based on the idea that you can advertise to people based on how you track them online. And at the same time, we're then able to close people with higher and higher granularity inside the CRM. Capabilities around the CRM grew. And then over those 5 years from 2015 to 2020, we get to the point where people are asking the question, we're actually doing a lot of stuff with warehouses. It's not just in AWS. Now there's this thing called Snowflake. Now there's this thing called Datadog. Now this thing, we have the capability now to track people in more modern, elegant ways than we ever could before. And so, starting around 2020, you start to see the rise of the modern data stack as an architecture framework, not only for marketing tech, but also for sales tech. Anybody who's used CRMs out there has probably said, we're pulling all of our data out of the CRM and into the warehouse. We can take a snapshot on a nightly basis. That literally is a consequence of these eras coming out. And the last thing I would say, we're kind of in this fourth era, which is, call it 2022 to today. And this is where we're actually living in a world where the lines are being blurred between a CRM and a CDP. HubSpot actually is a CRM and a CDP. They collect users and events. They also allow you to have a static data store of contacts and records and opportunities. Things like Segment are getting connected to tools like Salesforce. There are a bunch of new players in the CDP space. There's also a bunch of what we call reverse ETLs that have the ability to track data and forward that back into your system. So maybe one of the biggest distinctions I want to make here is that before 5, even 10 years ago, there were usually very few ways of doing things, and there were right ways of doing things. There was how to set up Salesforce correctly. There was how to connect these tools. Increasingly, as we've entered the modern warehouse age, there's lots of ways to connect tools. Connecting tools is a commodity now. And people have a lot of choice and agency and flexibility to design their own stack in a way that efficiently serves their business. And that maybe is part of the reason why we're all here talking today, is because we're at this precipice where there's no silver bullet. There's no one way to do things. There's lots of ways to do things. So figuring out what those right ways are for your business is a really core part of the discussion. Anyways, I've been talking a lot. I think I can probably hand it over to Sil.
Yeah. No, I mean, everything that Austin said, I experienced it myself, building this kind of early stage stack and where we are today. I think, the way I think about stack, without going into detail, because Austin is 1,000 times better than me at these things, is I think about the stack where everything is on the warehouse. Warehouse is basically your source of truth, right? And as Austin was saying, is you have your CDPs, you have your CRM and your BI. And the key thing is those three kind of stack where people interact with, the marketing team, the sales team, they need to see the same data, right? Your CDP, your marketing tool needs to say, these are the 10 customers we have, and these are all their names, right? And Salesforce needs to see the same thing. And then the executive dashboard that your CEO or your boss is looking at needs to see exactly the same 10 customers, right? Because that's the fundamental, to have agreement when you talk to people and when you start doing work together. In terms of capability, right, it's once you have this kind of confidence that the data is the same, is of high quality because of the stack you build, it lets you kind of start building campaign program that is not just still the marketing guy sending 5 emails, right? You can do cross collaboration with the sales team. This is where you can do omnichannel ABM activities, for example. This is where you can build automation with we'll talk about it later with AI outbound, when the marketing team or the growth team is doing automated outbounds, and like all that data feeds back, and the sales team is like, oh, okay, cool. Sales little agents are doing their work on LinkedIn on my behalf, and I'm confident that I can see that happening, right? And so I think that's kind of like the one of the benefits of building this type of stacks at the end of that kind of like technical journey, right? Yeah, I'll keep going here real quick on the slide.
So
Yeah,
just to make the segue to this segment, why we put it in there is, so I mean, we have now a foundation of what is sort of RevTech, what has been the history, does the stack look like today and towards the future. A lot of people here are GTM engineers, right? So they're from our community, and they're wondering, look, I'm maybe in an early stage or a more mature company, and that's going to change over time. What does it mean for my stack to evolve, and what does it require of me to evolve with it, right? And so, Sylvain, maybe take the slide. Tell us about what does it take for someone to sort of evolve with their stack in terms of capabilities.
Yeah, I think to me, I think about, I'll just move to the next slide. I think it's kind of easier to look at it. I think as an individual in a RevOps team, in the GTM engineering team, like kind of like a RevTech team, right? It's like you have to think about like how do you contribute, how do you grow, and what does the stack give you a superpower, right? And so for me, I really believe of like knowing what is possible and not possible, right? And so I think that's why it's very important as an individual working on those stacks to understand, like actually building the stack or be contributing to building the stack. So kind of like what's possible, what's not possible. Like the classic example is like, imagine you are in a meeting with like brainstorming ideas of how to achieve the goals, right? Like if you don't know what is hotspot, what is a reverse ETL tool, what is the warehouse, like your thinking and your creativity is going to be limited, because the first thing you're going to hear is like, well, I don't even know if it's possible, right? Or like you're going to rely on another person to tell you that it's possible or not, and that person might not be as educated on the stack either, right? And so basically you are limiting your opportunity to achieve or overachieve your goals, right? That's one. The second thing is also about knowing what is kind of like the possibility that you can run on those stack, right? And so again, it's like if you go back to this kind of like classic email example, it's like Austin was talking about MailChimp back in the day. Was like, I can send one email that is scheduled, right? And then people were like, well, that sounds great, but like, how can I send an email based on like a different type of behavioral trigger, right? And so people like Austin back in the days were basically writing code around MailChimp to basically trigger a bunch of MailChimp based on like certain trigger. And then there was like a new era of tools that came in, right? And so again, all of that is only possible because you know what your tool can do and cannot do and how to work around those things, right? And so like we'll talk about more about capabilities in the futures, right? Like, but I think that's kind of like very important as an individual. Like, how do you want to keep up with your stack? What you should be involved in building that stack, because even though if you're not technical and you don't write code, it's like what's possible and not possible, really. So yeah, that is me.
Yeah, I mean, before we go to the next slide, one thing I just want to add that I feel like is so important is just even the idea of thinking about capabilities. I mean, this is probably common knowledge for everybody, but it's just worth repeating. So many people think about problems in terms of tools. Oh, like I need to go buy an outbound tool, but they don't stop to ask the question of what am I trying to solve? What is the actual problem? Is it because we don't have enough leads? Is it because like people are not understanding our product? Is because we don't have enough engagement? I wish we could spend 30 to 45 minutes on just this topic. If there was one thing I'd leave with people, though, it's like, if you're in this position, whether it's a small startup or a medium-sized startup, if you're thinking about buying a tool or changing your stack, always try to take a step back and ask yourself the question, like, what is the real pain? What is the real problem to be solved? It's that product mindset that I actually think will make you a much more powerful operator in systems if you can remove the temptation to jump immediately to the problem. Sorry for interrupting, Sil. I just feel like you and I talked about that the other day, and I just wanted to add.
No, and I think this is kind of like a good segue into our next slide, right? Because I think like to your point is like when there's like, and this is kind of like where opinion differs at the early stage, right? Austin is like, I agree with you. That's like as a small scale, when you have a team of less than 10, it's like you need to start with like the outcome. Like I'm a very fanatic person of like spreadsheet and modeling. Is like looking at the data and being like, cool, this is the goal, why is it our goal, and then what is our current status quo, and then how do we close that gap, right? So it's like, again, using your lead analogy, it's like we need to increase our lead volume by 30%, right? It's like, buying a tool is not gonna help you achieve that goal, right? It's like, it's gonna be how you want to implement this, and the tool will be part of that kind of like implementation, but like the tool is not the solution. And I think this is kind of like when you split too early these kind of like roles, right? You don't have like a jack of all trade, like a GTM engineer. Like you're gonna have someone tells you like, hey Austin, we need to increase our lead flow by 30%. That's all you need to know. And then you'll be like, oh, I'm just a tech guy. I guess lead flow means we need to do more outbound. I'll just go buy an outbound tool, and my job is done here. And then whether it's being used properly, it's nobody's problem in a way, right? And so this is kind of like when there's no way to look holistically at the problem, right? And so yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on this before I continue ranting here for a long time.
Sure. No. I think we were talking about this the other day. It's like philosophically we're aligned, right? My biggest gripe is just with the term revenue engineer, because I think one, it's just great marketing from Clay, which is no diss. It's just, I think it sets the wrong expectations for people who are actually doing the role. But the role itself, the system description, the like what is being done, completely agree. And in the course that we do on RevTech, we actually talk about like the phases and life cycle of people that are operating in the space. And effectively at an early stage organization or even a medium-sized organization now with AI, there's an expectation that you can do more with less. There's this expectation that whether you're on marketing or sales, you actually have some hand to play in the shaping of the system architecture. That might mean setting up things like Zapier workflows or modifying databases or even simple stuff like setting outbound campaigns. There is an expectation now that operators, classical marketers, and even sellers are doing this work. And so there's this question of what to call them, right? As an organization scales, obviously roles become differentiated and very specific. And so it's easy to have RevOps and RevTech, but what do you do in a 20-person org where, I was just saying this in our comment thread, Chris on our team is technically a marketer, but like he's doing sales work. So what do you call that person? And I think increasingly organizations are finding themselves with that same debate of, well, we have a person internally who's working across a lot of surface areas to help coordinate the flow of data and our go-to-market motion. What do we call them? And so look, I have my opinions about what it should be called, but whether you call it a rev engineer or RevTech or marketer or seller, I think the idea that matters most is, are you clear and aligned on the value of this role and what they're doing? And to me, that's kind of the best part, is we're aligned philosophically on the value and the purpose of the role. And we just disagree on the term engineer. And again, the idea, at least from my point of view, is I've worked with a lot of growth engineers, and I feel like engineers should actually write code. Sometimes it can send the wrong signal to people internally if you call yourself an engineer, but you don't know how to write code. So I think as an organization scales, we'll have to come to terms with that. Like in the same way that a lot of people resist calling project managers product managers, it's more of a personal choice and debate that you have to figure out as your company scales.
One of the questions I have for you guys is also, does it matter if a rev engineer is working at a small company or a large company? Does that role evolve with the size of the company?
I think so. I think for me, it's like I agree a lot of things what Austin said, right? It's like, I think the title doesn't matter. I'm not a title guy myself, but like, I think it's just like the type of people that are excelling in what we're talking about here is like people who just, that get shit done, and in a way that you call when there's like problem. There's people who don't really care about boundaries. They just want to be either highly successful or they take any opportunity to learn and cross the aisle, right? And I think like, you mentioned Chris on the chat, it's like, it's like whatever it takes to get it done. It's kind of like I was advising another startup a couple of weeks back, and it's like, he was like, oh, you guys, because he's like an ex-army person, he's like what you're describing, this kind of role is like this kind of like special ops. Like, when someone has to do the job that nobody wants to be doing, you call the special ops. And I feel like that's very true of this role, is like, whatever it takes to get the job done. And whether it's like you need to own the stacks, you need to build campaign, you write emails, you do, calls, like it doesn't matter at the early stage, right? Like when you like a team of 10, and then this mentality continue to grow as the company scales, right? Ultimately, it's like the people who get like the large project done. I do agree with you, Austin. Is like, I think when people call it engineer and people don't write code, like I think like the little kid in me die. I think everybody in this room listening, like you need to learn how to code. You have no excuse to not learn how to code with like just with AI in general. I mean, people call that vibe coding. I mean, I've known people now that are literally writing Apex code with AI. They have an understanding of the logic and it kind of like works. I think there's no reason for people to not like pick up coding nowadays. It's never been easier than before. Like, I had to read books to learn how to code, and now you can just ask AI to do it for you. I encourage everybody
I love
to
that.
learn to
So
code.
I love that so much, and I totally agree. And actually, the story of my career was like, I was an engineer by trade. I was a civil and environmental engineer. My first startup, I remember jumping in and sitting next to our CTO, and he was having me do something. So he showed me how to write code and showed me how to do GitHub. And then I went and self-taught how to write code. And I would argue it's never been easier than ever to go do this on your own. Like you don't have to be a SQL expert to write SQL. You just have to know what SQL is and the object orientation, and GPT can write SQL for you. So I'm also not saying like, hey, you have to be a very good engineer. I think that you can be a pretty bad engineer and get really far in systems,
Just to kind of like last word of encouragement on that topic. I was talking to this woman that I coach, and she told me, because I always keep her to learn to code, and she came up with this tactic that every time she's in an Uber, she goes to GPT and she asks GPT, I'm in an Uber ride for 10 minutes. What should I learn about Python in 10 minutes? Do you mean like a 10-minute course? And then she just do a 10 minutes Python course. And that's how she's learning about Python, SQL, and anything like that. And, so every time there's a downtime, just take GPT out of your pocket and learn to code with GPT. At least learn the concept. That will open up your mind. So, yeah.
Excellent.
Go for it, Tarek. Get us back on track, Tarek. Yeah.
Yes. What I want to talk about next is, so now that we're clear on what a revenue engineer may or may not be, right, and how to become a good one to survive the scale of your company, let's talk about what scale actually involves stack-wise, right? So Silva, maybe if you attack the next slide, what does it mean to scale in terms of capabilities?
Yeah, and so we kind of like hinted at that. The way I think about it is like, obviously, if you are a small company, the company is like 8 months old or something like that, don't go berserk and start building Austin like end game stack of like warehouse with data science and like pipeline and all that stuff. Like, I think it's like build the right stack for the right stage of your company, and as long as you know what's coming next. And I like to think about like, again, this kind of like email concept, because I think like everybody understand those concepts. It's like, at the beginning, we start a new company. We are not going to do super sophisticated email campaign or anything like that. We're going to have one tool. We're going to start selling like, a couple of like emails campaign through channel, like, our power user versus not our power user, very basic segmentation, right? This same thing applies to like, if you're an outbound motion, you're not going to do like crazy omni-channel ABM based on first-party data managed with third-party data. You're going to do basic stuff, right? I think once you start in like thinking about the post-product market fit, it's like, this is usually when you're starting like hire your first AEs, or, depending on your motion, or like building this kind of like marketing team that's going to start scaling what you discovered, right? It's like, at that point, you have like a single source of truth. It can be your CRM, it can be a CDP, depending on your motion, right? And so at that point, you're starting to do a lot more like personalized email campaign. You're starting to dabble in like behavioral email campaign. Same thing from a sales point of view. You're starting to do like verticalized campaign, like use first-party signal, third-party signal to do those things. But again, like nothing crazy. It's just about like building a system and a stack that like, generating what I call like generating input, right? It's like we just like do stuff so the market reacts to us, and then we learn from the market, right? So again, like that's what the stack, you need to have a stack to that. And again, 5 tools cobbled together, that thing is completely fine. At this stage, you don't have to spend, 9 months like learning SQL and deploying a warehouse by yourself, So yeah, and then finally, after that, like growth stage, scale stage, like this is kind of like where we are entering like Austin territory here of like, let's make sure you pay down all the debts that you accumulated by going fast in the first 2 phases. This is usually when you're starting like doing like lots of like multi-channel strategy. You have like maybe 5 different marketing team, doing different things. You're gonna have like people doing ABM. You're gonna have people doing like inbound marketing, SEOs, programmatic SEO, content engineer, like the new shiny title out there, by the way. Like that's when you started scaling all those teams. Same thing on the sales tab. You're starting to have like verticalization of sales team or like territories. And so at that point, you want to basically be in a place where you can say, well, we closed this deal, or someone like bought our product with their credit card, like tell me everything they did before that, and then you need to be able to answer that question like very accurately to all the teams in the environment, right? And so I think this is kind of like where you're starting to have this kind of like growth stage here. And scale up is just like an extension. Is like, instead of having 5 teams, is 25 teams, right? Austin, feel free to jump in here if you want to add anything else.
No, I mean, I think you covered it really well. Yeah, no, I feel like you covered it great.
I think we're just getting to the part. And so for people listening, if there's one takeaway you take from the theory perspective, it's this next part, but what is the FRIC framework, right? So you do evolve, but how do you evaluate yourself by that FRIC framework? And I say that because we see a lot of people using Cargo, building stacks with Cargo. They never know if they're under engineering, over engineering. So how do you evaluate your stack with scale, Austin?
Yeah. So this is a framework that actually I thought about a lot in MarTech and applied it and used it quite heavily at Ramp. We actually used this to do our first systems evaluation and systems audit. So I've actually like deployed this framework into the field. I know a lot of times you see frameworks out there, but they've never actually been stress tested by people trying to use them in an organization. And it was really helpful. I think it was great at helping consolidate problems into a very clear understanding for people. Now, granted, lots of leaders out there don't like to read frameworks, so you're still going to have that problem whether you use mine or others. They sometimes scoff at a framework for describing a problem, but I do think it helps give folks an understanding of the problem set. And there's really, basically you can think of like every stack has a number of different levers on which you're evaluated. You have focus, redundancy, interoperability, and coupling. And I want to point out that like all these have trade-offs with another. So you will never have an all green stack. And if you do, you're probably not being realistic about what's wrong with your stack. And what I would say is, as your company grows, you're going to have some things that flex really hard, green or red, that become less green or red. And then you have some that will flex the other way. You could also view this on like a point scale. At Ramp, we actually did a point scale. We evaluated all these criteria on 1 to 5. And we talked about where we wanted to be based on what was most important to the business. And, for example, at a scaled startup or growth or scaled startup, depending on how you view Ramp, we actually cared a lot about redundancy and about making sure coupling was not hard and maintaining flexibility. And the way that I define flexibility, which is kind of the outcome of this framework, is flexibility. To me, it was the ability to answer the call from leadership to do something. If we get asked, hey, how do you achieve this outcome in a campaign? How do you trigger a new email marketing thing? Hey, we have a new vendor we're working with. How do we enable it? It's the ability to respond to that and not have it be hard or difficult or multi-week. And for a lot of enterprises in particular at this scale stage, they fail on flexibility because of all the red tape and the data coupling that makes it hard to do so. So I can talk a little bit about each of these in example if you want, Tarek, or we can spend some time high level. What do you think would be the best use?
I think, first of all, even for people like me, let's dumb down the FRIC. What does it actually mean? And then we have a couple of slides and examples on a couple of those segments of the framework.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, let's go through this. FRIC, focus, redundancy, interoperability, coupling. Together, you can imagine this is a math equation that equals flexibility. Focus is really how well specific tools do specific jobs. This is really actually quite clear in most scaled organizations because you have a procurement process, you have a vendor alignment process, you tend to only buy tools for specific purposes. You actually don't have a lot of overlapping redundancy at a scaled organization because you've grown the team and you have the ability to be very precise in what you bring from a tool set onto your architecture. So focus is just how well does a tool do a specific job. An example of like an extremely focused tool would be something like an outbounding tool that only does outbounding and nothing else. Something that is not very focused would be a tool that has 5 or 6 different capabilities inside, and you have 2 or 3 of these tools all linked together. And so when a marketer or salesperson comes on board and they say, hey, how do I create an audience and send it out to a tool? You could answer with 5 different ways. Now, again, having that redundancy is not a problem in and of itself, but how well you've architected your system to answer that question is what focus actually means. That brings us to redundancy, right? Redundancy can be both good and bad. Redundancy becomes great when you're trying to achieve an outcome, say send a campaign, create an audience, create a data flow, and you have lots of different ways to do it. For really small startups, I would often say like they have kind of the best ability to have redundancy, but they manage it the worst because they don't really think carefully about how to connect tools and how to move data. So what happens is you end up doing it in a myriad of different ways and not documenting it. And before you know it, there are 3 or 4 different tools doing the exact same thing in different ways. So redundancy is really about, okay, do we have the ability to take action, create a capability, send data? And do we have another way of doing it so that if that primary way fails, we still maintain the flexibility? Nothing is worse than you think you have one system to rule them all, except a new capability comes along from a marketer and you're totally screwed because there's not this one data integration you need. So having redundancy in your system, the ability to move data and connect tools and take capability actions is a really important piece of this. I'll say one last example and then we'll move on to interoperability. When I worked at Branch, we sold 2 types of technology. We had deep linking and attribution. And part of our sales strategy as a vendor, just putting this out there, was to go sell deep linking because we knew that companies had attribution and deep linking were kind of the same. So one of our strategies to get embedded in competitors' deals was to go after deep linking, not attribution. Even though deep linking and attribution were fundamentally the same technology, we found ourselves in competitive deals with lots of companies where we just offered a slightly better version of the same thing. The reason I'm telling you this story is because vendors will do this to you. Vendors will say that they do something very specifically that's slightly bespoke. And if you're not careful, if you're not perceptive, and if you're not clear about what the value of the tool is you're bringing in, you'll find yourself with lots of vendors doing the exact same thing. So just want to share that. Interoperability and coupling. Interoperability is just how well does this tool talk to other tools? And it's not, hey, I went on their integrations page and I saw 1,000 tiles. It's how well does this tool connect to our specific set of tools? What is the shape, type, and format of that data? And is it going to fit our needs now and in the future? The classic example I always like to share in the CDP landscape is that there were always 3 types of data integrations in CDP. There were event streams out of the tool, there were event streams into the tool, and there were audiences. And a lot of people would be like, oh, there's 1,000 integrations with Segment, so that must be the tool we need. And then they get into Segment and be like, oh fuck, like I actually can't get data into Segment because I looked at the tile and saw that it had HubSpot, but it's not actually what I want it to do. So this is just a call to action. When you integrate tools in your stack, look at. I'm sorry. What did you say, Sil?
And that's how you start learning how to code, because you want to work around the limitation of these tools usually.
Exactly right. So just be thoughtful and careful about those. And again, really simple strategy. When you go to buy a new tool, look at the integration page and really ask yourself the question: do I actually know what's going to come out of this data stream? Like, not only do I know how to click the thing, and that's often a really common thing I ask vendors to do, is I'll be like, just sit down with me for 5 minutes and show me how you connect it. Because a lot of times people will just blow smoke up your ass and say they have integrations and they don't actually exist. So like, have them show you exactly how it works. Last one is coupling, which is to say, how tightly coupled are tools? How tightly welded are these tools together? This can often make it really easy for you to take action or really hard. And so one simple strategy here is to say, when you have a stack, try to move data from left to right, meaning from the top of your stack through the funnel down to your warehouse. Now, the reason I say that is because a lot of people are very tempted to go around clicking buttons to integrate every tool in every single direction, and they don't have a thoughtful approach to how data moves from one point to another. And then before you know it, you'll find yourself in what I like to call systems hell, which is where you have 6 tools that are all connected to each other talking. So you have like HubSpot talking to Salesforce. Salesforce is doing stuff that has inputs from 5 tools. It's talking back to HubSpot because you enabled the the dual sync. And then HubSpot is also talking to Segment. You have some engineer set up an API call to send data into HubSpot, and you can't fucking figure out where that's coming from. So this is what I mean by coupling. How tightly connected are all your tools, and are they in multi directions or one direction? So one common thing that I see when I do system audits and even when I advise people, I'm like, try to move data in one direction. Try not to have data moving back in the opposite direction it came in, unless there's a really specific purpose. And so, I mean, you know about this better than anybody else, but it's like, this is the whole modern data architecture. You move it into the warehouse, and then your reverse ETL becomes the source where you move data out to the rest of your stack. And it becomes a very clear loop. If you're connecting tools with these out-of-box integrations, you can find yourself in this weird pattern where you're moving data out in between tools, and it creates what I like to call systems hell.
Super clear. That's exactly what I was fishing for. That's perfect, Austin. I need one more little segment on what is composability, and you've talked a lot about this. So very quickly, what is composability, and why should GTM engineers care about it?
You want this from me or Sil?
I'd have you start to introduce composability, and Sil tell us about, does he care about this in his day-to-day at Augment or Census and so on?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this ultimately gets back to, the idea of flexibility. What is flexibility? Why do I say that word? Flexibility and composability are related. Like, if you have a composable stack, you are more inclined to have a flexible stack. Flexibility, again, is the ability to respond to business changes. It's the ability to respond to whatever is coming down the pipeline, what's coming down the leadership pipeline, both from a capability and data perspective. And so I would argue that if you take a more composable approach, if you think about coupling in the right way, you'll create a more flexible architecture, which will make you more resilient to challenges in your stack. So that's kind of the first piece. The second thing is, well, I'm actually going to steal this third bullet because this is actually the main reason why I built this framework, which is around debugging. I talk about debugging hell all the time. I had this experience when I first joined Ramp. Every single week, we'd have a dashboard flashing and 1 million people running around with their hair on fire saying, we're losing 10 million in pipeline because, something in Salesforce broke and we can't figure it out, right? Everybody's had that experience where you're losing pipeline, you got leaders on the line asking questions, and you can't actually immediately diagnose what the problem is because a field in Salesforce was changed by a trigger in some other tool, which was influenced by a myriad of other capabilities in that tool. In our case, it was always like, we have a segment event that would go to a HubSpot property, that would trigger a workflow, that would trigger another workflow inside of Salesforce, that would trigger a field change, that would then result in the thing that I cared about. So if you wanted to debug that, you'd have to go up like 6 layers, and every single one of those things would have to be checked. And that's what we mean by coupling. That's what we mean by composability, is when those choices were made, nobody was thinking about the consequences. They weren't thinking about, hey, how hard is this going to be to debug in the future? This is, again, the difference in my mind between an operator and an architect. An operator is just going to do the thing. They're going to get it done. An architect is going to think really carefully about that choice, knowing the future consequences. I'll pause there. I'm sure you got a lot to say on this.
I will just kind of like a very concrete example here, and give a big plug to Cargo, because I'm actually working on something like that at Cargo, right? And so we've all been there, building enrichment, and it's like you enrich in Salesforce, you enrich in your warehouse, you enrich in your spreadsheet, you enrich everywhere, right? And a good way to think about this is like, in Cargo, I'm right now using tools like Cargo tools, right? And so I build all those micro tools, and one of the tools, it's like find someone LinkedIn URL from an email address, right? And so that's just written in LinkedIn URL, and then, or a contact, right? And then you have another tool that takes that LinkedIn URL and then go get all of the data, right? And then there's another tool that in this chain that is being called that is like, oh, well, I want to know the company, information. And again, this tool takes a LinkedIn URL as an input, right? And then I have another tool that is like, hey, based on a job title and like a JSON that represents like demographic information of a user, I can infer the persona of my user, right? So I create those 5 tools. Now I have these 5 tools that I can all put together, and then I can basically wrap them up into one big tool that I can call everywhere in my stack. Like, so there's a button in Salesforce, the reps click enrich this context, it runs all those tools and enrich Salesforce, right? I'm in my warehouse, every time we run a job to get like our new users, things like that, it calls exactly all those tools. Like an ops person want to do a quick spreadsheet enrich, before an event or something like that in a spreadsheet, because spreadsheet still lives in our world, right? Like, again, you can enrich the whole spreadsheet with the same tool. And again, someone in my team can go and basically go update the logic in Cargo, because maybe it's like, oh, you know what? We're going to add this new waterfall enrichment provider, or maybe we're going to add another field. They update Cargo, one of those tools, right, for example, and everybody everywhere get the benefit of that. And the only reason that works is because we took this whole process, we created reusable components that now can be used everywhere, right? And so again, if we have a spreadsheet of just LinkedIn URL, like, we can enrich those people. We have a spreadsheet of like just domain name of account, we can reuse the same tool that was part of the bigger one, right? And I think that's like a good way of like thinking about composability. And that goes back to what Austin was saying, is like, this is how you can go very fast, because now when the executive team tells you like, hey, can you enrich this thing really quick? 5 clicks and you're done. You don't have to rebuild yet another workflow from scratch just to do enrichment there, right? And again, and go back to the data consistency that I was saying at the beginning, is like the enrichment that is in Salesforce, that says they have 600 employees, is going to be the same 600 in the spreadsheet. It's going to be the 600 employees anywhere. And so people are not like, why is this thing saying 500 and this one 600? It's like, oh, this is like an old enrichment workflow that we built 2 years ago that nobody know how to use anymore, right? And I think that's like a good example of like composability at like the implementation level. But the same thing applies, like how you build your stack. And so, I think if you want to continue learning about this thinking, it's all down to engineering. Go learn about functional programming, and you're halfway there. But I'll shut up now on this topic.
That was very clear, and I love the examples, because you're doing this at an early stage in Augment, right? And so you see that like we go back to that evolutive staircase. And so we had a couple more examples, Austin. So because you did a very good job of explaining the FRIC, maybe let's quickly go over those ramp examples, which are like very much like scale, right? So even companies at scale can have sort of design problems. Maybe talk to us about that. So I think we have one on focus and dependency.
Sure thing. This is the slide you want me to use. I don't know if I was jumping ahead.
No, this is good, because I want people to have a map of what FRIC looks like at an actual company, right? So what can they walk away with?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the most classic example of focus that I see in a B2B stack is audience creation. How do we create audiences? Where to create audiences? What is that data? Where does it live? In the case of Ramp, we had a marketing team that was creating audiences every day for a variety of paid channels and non-paid channels. And we had audience creation tools in Segment, in HubSpot, in Salesforce, in our warehouse, in Clearbit, and one other place. Oh, and High Touch. So yeah, that's seven different places you can create audiences. So naturally, there's this question of, where do I create audiences? Well, we didn't have an answer to that. So what people were doing is whatever the hell they wanted. And you can imagine that resulted in a lot of questions. You have a marketer who pulled a list from Salesforce that doesn't have the fields they want. You have a marketer who created a list in Segment. It only has anonymous IDs. You have a marketer who created a list in HubSpot, but that's only based on email data. By having the option to create audiences in 7 different places, you have an unfocused stack. It's not clear to the end user how to achieve the outcome or the capability. And this was actually not that hard of a fix. It required us to kind of go out and map our understanding of people's expectations, align on a plan, educate people, and then, I really mean it, you have to close the doors. You have to close off the ability to do the action in other tools, because people will find their way back in and they'll continue to repeat those behaviors if you don't. This is actually a big pattern, I'd say, in scaled organizations, not in startup organizations or small ones, is that you have to be deliberate in actually closing doors, because many of these tools have such a wide variety of capability options that if you don't close the doors, you're leaving yourself open to debugging hell. And so in our case, that's what we did is we align on a single strategy for creating audiences. We developed documentation on it. We made sure to have all the data. We ticketed the requirements for things that were missing. And then we closed and locked off those capabilities so that marketers couldn't find their way back into that space doing the same thing again and again.
Super clear. Super clear. We have one more example on coupling. I don't know if you want to go over it, Austin.
Sure, yeah. If we got some time, yeah. So, and then there's another example of coupling. Here's a good one. So, the most common example, and again, our biggest bane at Ramp, was coupling between HubSpot and Salesforce. Another one I see pretty commonly is between like a data provider and a CDP, if they have their own in-house analytics library, or something like a CDP and product analytics. It's any space where you have two tools that are providing pretty similar roles, but there's some bespoke purpose to each of them. So for example, HubSpot and Salesforce, they're both CRMs. HubSpot kind of does email a little better for B2B. They're both like trying to do the same thing. They have basically the same data. They need the same data. And guess what? Some brilliant product manager at HubSpot built, a bidirectional sync to make all of our lives hell. So they have the one-way sync and the two-way sync. One-way sync can be either way. In our case at Ramp, it's this very alluring button. You just click it and all of a sudden all your attributes are mapped back and forth. But the reality is like you bring so much pain with that. There are all these oddities based on the tools that are connected to each of those systems. Because you can imagine each of these integrations is effectively like an API that has its own rate limiting, its own preferences of data. And so in the image that you see, you have Salesforce with 5 or 6 different tools connected to it. You have HubSpot with 5 or 6 different tools connected to it. And each of those is creating records at the exact same time in a database and trying to reconcile themselves with one another. And what would happen is just all the time we'd run into errors, into problems, duplication errors, things not syncing or syndicating properly. And it's not anybody's fault. It's the fact that these two tools are basically maintaining identical databases of one another side by side. And this is an example of really bad coupling, because if something breaks in one tool, it is now affecting the other tool. And so you can imagine if somebody does something wrong, they push a bad PR, data, is wrong, we ingest something incorrectly, a system field changes, it now impacts another mission critical system and all connected systems to that. So this is where coupling is really, really hell. Is like if you don't have things in a streamlined fashion, connecting them all in a two-way sync, when something impacts one part of your system, it's going to affect the other part of your system. It's like in a hotel where you don't have fire doors. That's the whole purpose of fire doors, is to like lock the fire from spreading. In this case, you're putting fans in there, And so the solution was somewhat painful. It took a while. We systematically went through every tool and we asked the question, where does this data need to live, right? Where's the source of this data? And a lot of cases what that meant is taking the integration and pulling it into the warehouse, and then using the reverse ETL, high touch, to stream that data back up into, the tool of choice. So once we kind of cleansed the top, we got a bunch of those data integrations out, we have stuff moving in a uniform direction down the stack and then back into the tools of choice. Now it became a little bit easier when there was a problem to debug, right? You can trace its lineage up the tree. And the thing that we really pushed hard for, and I think this was achieved after I left, was the full decoupling of HubSpot and Salesforce, meaning it's a one-way sync. HubSpot is just a spoke to Salesforce. So Salesforce was really the center of truth for data before the warehouse. I think it eventually was the warehouse because there's ETLs pulling data from other sources into the warehouse. We can talk a lot about how Salesforce basically is a snapshot record database. So it's like actually not the best place for us to truth. But for us, it was fine to have things flowing through Salesforce into Snowflake, because it meant that we had eliminated this bidirectional sync from HubSpot. Now, one really big benefit of this that I'll call out that maybe is not obvious is that HubSpot was not only troublesome from a coupling perspective, but that coupling made it hard for us to explore new capabilities. We couldn't actually evaluate email marketing tools because HubSpot was so tightly integrated. If we wanted to go change our email marketing capability, we would actually have to touch and influence our CRM. So this is a big challenge. Whenever you click those buttons that are bidirectional sync, you may be creating a headache for yourself in the future because you're creating a dependency. And one of the really, big things we wanted to do when I was there is we wanted to buy a new email marketing tool like Iterable or Braze. And we just simply couldn't, because it would be so much work to untangle HubSpot from Salesforce to have it be a standalone product that we could then evaluate side by side with Braze and Iterable. So that's a really good example of bad coupling and how it can have a lot of these unbeknown consequences on your stack later.
Very clear. And so for people out there listening live and async, Clarify's website has a very good explanation section of examples for each part of the FRIC. Obviously, we couldn't cover all of it, but I thank you, Austin, for going through that. We have another segment which we'll use as to end with. Sylvain, so for the GTM engineers listening to this, right, what is the cost of not thinking about stack the right way? And we talked about all the possibilities that agents and AI gives us today. Tell us what is enabled by a good stack being there in terms of AI.
Yeah. So I think everybody saw recently the memo actually that was published yesterday or the day before about the internal Shopify memo of first try to do it with AI before trying to hire someone, right? And I think that resonated really true with me in a way. I think if you try to do that without everything we talked about, it's like garbage in, garbage out. If you do an AI agent, I'll use the perfect example of that is account research. How many goddamn account research tool, AI account research tool exists out there in the world? A lot, right? And if I just said hey, I work at Augment, tell me what you know about Clarify, it's probably going to be pretty garbage, the result of this account research outcome, right? But now let's say I have my data, right? I say, hey, this is what Clarify did on my website. These are the content that Clarify did, that the content that Clarify engaged with me on the content. This content is tagged correctly with type of content, the summary of the content, right? And then I say, hey, by the way, these are the 5 people at Clarify who also interacted with my product. This is what they've done with my product. They sign up, they did a bunch of things, right? And now I say, cool, this is what they've done. This is where they are on their journey. This is what I know about their business. So waterfall enrichment, all the things we talked about, right? So we package all of that. And then we say, and this is what success looks like at my organization. We look for people who spike like this. These are last 60 good customers, whatever you want to do as a B2B, right? And then guess what's going to happen? The agent is going to do a fantastic job at summarizing and recommending the next action, right? And so again, all of that is only possible if you have good, clean data you can trust before that, right? And so if you take this further, right, it's imagine you keep running down this flow, right? It's cool. Well, now I know this business, the agent is recommending me to do something. Probably it's going to be crap, the thing that the agents recommend to do, because he has no idea about what success looks like and what can they offer. So this is where you come back and say, well, these are all my offers, right? An offer can be a recording of a webinar, Tariq, right? It could be a trial, it could be at a dinner, it could be anything, right? And so at that point, you're going to be oh, now we can now the agent's going to recommend you what the next best offer. Again, it only can do that successfully because you are feeding them your data, right? And then finally, you want to take that and you want to get the SDR out of the loop, right? You want to be sending that email on behalf of your company, right? Again, you can only send that email if the first 2 steps are true and high quality data, right? Because then at that point, it's going to write a pretty good email, trust me. But imagine if you were doing that flow without anything we just talked about, it's going to be the worst email the world has ever seen, right? And then your brand is going to be destroyed and all the bad stuff that's going to happen, right? And so I think this is the type of things that having a good stack and what a GTM engineer should be all about is having a clean foundation so we can start building just some AI capability, right? So that's one play. Same thing with the agent, right? Agent supporting a sales rep is I'm a sales rep. I'm super busy. I'm going to use again the account research thing, right? It's if you don't build it right, it's going to be cool. I want to prospect this company called Rippling, Rent, right? And the reps is going to be going on LinkedIn, looking at all the people's, one by one, they're going to waste 45 minutes basically prospecting the account, right? Again, a good AI agent can basically at the click of a button be oh, based on what we know about the company, the type of activities you want to do against this account, these are 80 people you should prospect, right? And then this is kind of like the first thing we talked about comes into play. It's like as an AE, I can just click the button and be like, yeah, that sounds good. Everything that is below the line, basically non-decision maker, I want you to automate it like outbound to them, mostly for awareness, not to really book meetings. Like, it's either going to be collecting information or awareness, right? And then again, as a seller, I'm like basically 10x more productive because I just got 45 minutes plus back of my time, right? So at that point, it's like, instead of closing 10 deals a day, 10 deals a day would be nice. 10 deals a month, right? It's like, well, you can go into closing maybe 20 deals a month, right? And so that's kind of like what I was talking about at the beginning, is like technology allow people to be better, right? And I think this is like an example of like AI in action. Is like, it's not replacing a BDR, it's not yet like, it's not doing all the stuff. It's just like taking your best sellers and making them even better, right? And I think that can only be enabled if you have a clean a clean foundation, a clean stack that you can trust, and the data is like 80% accurate. You'll always make mistakes, that's okay, right? But yeah, that's kind of like one example. The other example, more like the marketing side, that I think is like super promising, is replacing the QBRs and CSM and like kind of like product updates and delight, right? So it's like, who loves going to a QBR, CSM with the vendor? No one, because it's kind of like useless. And so what you think you can do about with AI is like, you have all those first party data of how people interact with your product. And basically AI is very good at like summarizing product data and seeing patterns, right? And so you can take all of that data. So like, I'll tell you the example we did at Census is like, we took like the account, all the things they were doing. So Census was a reverse ETL tool, all the things, like all the errors, like the destination that they were using, like the type of data they were syncing, right? And then we fed that into the multiple prompts. And then basically what it's come out is like recommendation of like new use case they could do based on the data we have and the connection they didn't have, right? But also identify like error rates and things like that. And so we could basically send an email to a customer to be like, this is what we recommend to you to do with Census going forward. And guess what? People were like, oh, that sounds amazing. Can I talk to you about it, right? And so they basically, we reverse QBR them. Max, this one is for you. It's like they raise their hand and be like, oh, I want to learn more about this thing, right? And so that's what you do in CSM land. And you can do exactly the same thing from a marketing weekly digest type of emails. Like, you basically don't know the email you're going to send to those customers at the end of the week of their usage, but like, you just send an email, every Friday about their usage, and the AI writes it for you, right? And I think that's like, again, can only be done if you have like a good foundation. Like, don't try to send an AI-based email every Friday if you have no confidence in your data, right? Because that's just going to be a bad email. That's going to, again, like kill your brand, and people are going to unsubscribe and then you fucked. So yeah, that's kind of like AI capability that you can build on top of the slide that we talked about. There's lots of other things you can do, but like, these are kind of like the simple ones that has a high impact in my experience.
And that's why you should have a clean stack, right? To protect your
Yes.
brand so that AI can do its job.
Yeah, and I think it's going back to Austin. This is going back to the coupling side. Is like, if you have too much coupling, like, you're gonna put even more garbage inside the machine, which is gonna confuse the AI, generate like bad insight, bad content in general, and then internally, the stakeholder is gonna be like, "Still, this is a stupid idea. You're just doing a lot of bad things," and then basically you don't have social capital to lead new project, and basically you are alone on your little GTM engineer island, and nobody wants you. So don't let that happen to you.
Daniel is saying our
nothing
next talk should be relationship ops tech. I
Yeah.
love that title.
Oh man, that would be a big topic. I think Austin has lots of thoughts on that one too.
Excellent. I wish we had more time to cover more ground, because honestly, as we said, we could talk for hours about understanding the frameworks more and all the possibilities. Already, thank you, Sylvain and Austin, for giving us your time and giving us this education. We have a quick plug on Austin's course. Austin, very quickly, tell us about the course next week.
Sure. Got an amazing class coming up next week. If you like this discussion and you want to learn and go deeper onto these types of topics, that's exactly what this is. It's the RevTech course, RevTech Essentials, offered through Maven. Got a promo code for everybody who is here today. Look out for the email. I think we'll send it then. And yeah, we're going to go into a bunch of different topics, but very specifically things like, proven methods for how to set up your stack, how to integrate data, ways to align different members of their team, obviously how to select specific tools, and how to prevent your stack from kind of getting out of hand, much to the same way that we talked about today.
Excellent. And so there's a link in the chat. There's a promo code that Chris just shared. We'll share the promo code again in the emails. This event was organized and requested by the GTM engineers community. This was the first episode of GTM 101. We're going to be coming back with a second episode, and we're very open to what that should be. So give us your ideas in the Slack. And I always say this community is composed of living people who are very cool. So Sylvain is part of this community. Austin will very quickly be part of this community as well. These people are happy to sort of give their advice and interact with you, talk about your problems. So please leverage them. If you're not part of this community, you have a QR code there to join it. We hope that you had an interesting session with us. Thank you for tuning in for people async and for people giving us your time live. Sylvain, Austin, thank you again. That was great. We learned a lot. Any final words?
Go learn how to code. It'll change your life.
Yes. I agree with that. +1, learning how to code changed my life. It made me who I am in this profession. And also just thank you for everybody for coming out to attend. Really appreciate it. I know 30 to 45 minutes is a lot of time for folks. So thank you all for coming and listening.
Awesome. Thank you so much, both Sylvain and Austin. We appreciate it. And we'll have you back soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. This is the end of the first episode. Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.